everyone, Mariel Sarmiento, and this is my presentation on leadership diversity, where I will be discussing leadership during a hypothetical wildfire crisis within Riverside County, and I'll go over a specific scenario explaining how different leadership theories from Van Wart apply as this crisis changes over time. So I'll focus on why people would follow different leaders at different time frames within the crisis. The crisis I selected is a fast-moving wildfire in Riverside County, and this type of crisis is realistic for Southern California because we do see wildfires often and they can spread quickly due to our drier air conditions, high winds, and changing weather patterns. So in this scenario, the fire begins in the city of Moreno Valley and creates evacuation warnings, smoke concerns, road closures, poor air quality, and pressure on local emergency services. And this scenario would require strong leadership because people would need direction, information, reassurance, and coordination overall very quickly. So for this presentation specifically, I'll be narrowing the impacted area to the Moreno Valley College and nearby residential area, and this area would impact students, staff, residents, families, people who may be vulnerable such as older adults, people without the reliable transportation to evacuate, and people who are even experiencing homelessness. And so I would estimate overall about 1,500 to 2,500 people that could be directly affected within the Moreno Valley College area. And the event itself would be very fast-paced within the first few hours, but the aftermath of the actual fire could continue for days, weeks, or even months when we're looking into recovery. And so the services impacted would include fire response, law enforcement, transportation, public health, emergency sheltering, utilities, and even nonprofit services to come and support. And for the time frames, I'll focus on 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, and 3 weeks. So for chapter 1, the concept I am applying is formal versus informal leadership. So in this time of crisis, leadership is not only about having that formal title, it's really about influencing people toward a purpose, especially when stakes are high, such as in a crisis, and the public is depending on government and community systems to respond, but within those first 3 minutes, that can't be expected. So the journal article I am connecting to this concept is Boyne and Hart's article on public leadership in times of crisis, and their work explains that crisis leadership requires leaders to help people make sense of what's happening, communicate direction, and maintain that legitimacy regardless of having a formal title. So this fits the 3-minute stage of the wildfire because people may not have that official information, but they still need someone to reduce confusion when high stakes are happening. And so in the scenario, the leader might be a campus employee, a community member, outreach worker, or a nearby supervisor on campus. And so people would follow this person because they ideally would be present, calm, and are able to give immediate direction. And this shows that early on in a crisis, leadership depends less on the formal authority and more so on credibility, confidence, and general sense-making. For chapter 2, I'm using directive leadership found on page 39, where Van Wart describes directive leadership as a style where the leader gives clear guidance, explains expectations, and helps coordinate tasks. And so in a normal work setting, directive leadership can feel too controlling, but in the first few minutes of a crisis, it can be necessary. And so the journal article I'm using to expand on this concept is Uckel's article on effective leadership behavior, where the author explains that effective leadership behavior depends on what followers need from the leader in a specific situation. And so during an emergency, followers need the clear direction more than just discussion or debate. They need immediate action. And so in the wildfire scenario, directive leadership applies at this 3-minute mark, because where people may see smoke, hear warnings, notice other people panicking. There's a lot to take on in those first few minutes. And so a directive leader can help by clearly telling people to move away from the danger, follow emergency alerts, avoid the blocked roads, or leave an area calmly. And so people would listen to that leader who removes uncertainty and just gives simple, safety-focused direction. Now for chapter 3, I'm applying situational leadership. And the main idea is that there is no single leadership style that works perfectly in every situation. And so the leader needs to understand the conditions, the level of urgency, the followers' needs, and the type of decision that needs to be made. And so the journal article I'm using here is Vroom and Jago's The Role of Situation in Leadership. And their article supports the idea that leadership effectiveness depends heavily on the situation. And in some situations, participation and group input are important. And in other situations, quick decisions and clear authority really matter more. And so within this wildfire scenario, situational leadership applies especially at the 3-hour mark point, because by this point, the crisis has moved beyond that first moment of confusion. And so emergency officials, fire personnel, law enforcement, public information may now be hopefully involved by that 3-hour mark. And so leadership must shift from immediate direction to an organized response so that people, because people follow leaders who adjust their styles to match the seriousness and complexity of the situation. Now moving on to chapter 4, I'm using inspirational motivation, which is an important part of transformational leadership. So this focuses on motivating people, building shared purpose, and helping followers believe that their effort really matters. And this style becomes especially important after the immediate danger has passed and people are dealing with fear, frustration, and exhaustion. And so the journal article I'm using to support this concept is Base's article on transformational leadership. Base does explain that transformational leadership helps move followers beyond just basic compliance following rules, but creating purpose, motivation, and commitment. And this is useful in a crisis recovery setting because people may need more than instructions. They may need hope in spite of all the fear and exhaustion that's happening. And so in this wildfire scenario, inspirational motivation fits best at the 3-week stage. At this point, it's where the community may be dealing with displacement, property damage, smoke impacts, just overall public frustration and emotional stress. And so a leader who can clearly communicate a recovery vision can help people believe that rebuilding is possible so they can move forward. And people would follow this leader because they feel that the leader understands the hardship and can connect recovery work to a larger purpose. Now for chapter 5, I'm applying collaborative leadership or networking leadership, which is important when no single individual or agency can solve a problem alone. And so in public administration, many problems do require coordination across different departments, nonprofit organizations, and community partners. And the journal article I'm using here is Waugh and Stripe's article, Collaboration and Leadership for Effective Emergency Management, which explains that emergency management depends heavily on collaboration because disasters can cross organizational boundaries. And this connects directly to a wildfire crisis because fire response isn't just handled by the fire department. So in my scenario, collaborative leadership applies strongly at this stage, 3 days. The fire personnel, law enforcement, emergency management, public health, transportation, the college itself, and nonprofit partners may all be involved. And people follow a collaborative leader because that leader can create shared direction and reduce confusion between different agencies involved. And so instead of working in silos, the leader does help everyone understand that their role is part of the larger response. Next is chapter 6, where I'm applying ethical leadership, and this includes the idea that ethical leaders can't assume they know and have all the wisdom on their own. They do need to create expectations, enforce rules fairly, and include important information and perspectives from followers and community partners. And so the journal article I'm using here is Brown, Trevino, and Harrison's article on ethical leadership, where they explain that ethical leaders influence followers by modeling appropriate behavior, communicating ethical expectations, and making fair decisions. And so in this wildfire scenario, the ethical leadership applies most strongly at this 3-day stage, because by then the crisis isn't just about evacuation and immediate action. It does involve shelter access, donation, and overall resource distribution. And people will follow an ethical leader because they believe the leader is honest, fair, transparent, and actually focused on the overall public good. Next, for chapter 7, I'm applying the concept of leader-member exchange theory. So leadership isn't only about what the leader does, it's also about how followers respond to the leader, whether they trust them, and whether they would choose to cooperate with them. And the journal article I'm using is on followership theory, and this article goes hand in hand and explains that followers are not passive. They can actually help shape leadership by choosing whether to engage, question, support, or resist. And this concept applies well at this 3-day stage of the wildfire crisis, because at this point, staff, resident, nonprofit provider, anyone involved, they may be tired and frustrated, and they may not automatically follow a leader just because the leader has a formal title. They are more likely to follow when they believe the leader is listening, being honest, making fair decisions, understanding what's happening to the people on the ground, and actually including them in the process. Finally, I'm using e-leadership, which is found within the competency model approach, where leaders are expected to be competent in communication, whether it's face-to-face or virtually. So when transmitting information, giving motivation and intention, that can be heard and understood by anyone who is considered a good communicator, which is necessary in a crisis. And so this concept can be applied to how leaders and organizations must communicate good or bad information from a crisis. And they do need to learn from the crisis, adjust to changing conditions, improve for future response, and then communicate all that to the people. So the journal article I'm using by Comfort discusses how crisis management depends on cognition, communication, coordination, and control. And I connect to the leadership because after a wildfire, leaders need to reflect on what worked, what failed, and what type of communication should be improved before the next emergency. So within this scenario, this concept applies at this 3-week stage, where the community is still recovering, but leaders should also be reviewing communication gaps, evacuation issues, service barriers, partner coordination, and be able to communicate, disseminate that information to all the departments and community organizations involved. And people follow these type of communicative, adaptive leaders that can communicate with transparency, because those leaders are willing to learn, admit to problems, and improve the system overall. So to summarize, the leadership needed in this wildfire scenario does change as the crisis evolves over time. And overall, the scenario shows that crisis leadership within public administration does require flexibility, communication, transparency, and ethical judgment. And with that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.